Hi everyone, my name is Bowen, a graduate student from Peking University. Today I'm going to present our paper accepted by the 14th Conference on Artificial General Intelligence. When we started to think about how to realize AGI, a question came out to us. Is there a ceiling which limits the highest level of AGI? Maybe we have a preliminary answer now. That is the feeling, the gap between intelligence and mind. The best reference to achieving AGI is our mind. Intelligence is objective. However, the mind has both objective and subjective aspects. In philosophy of mind, generally speaking, the subjective mind refers to phenomenal consciousness or called subjective experience that has qualia. The feeling which I'm talking about is a kind of phenomenal consciousness. Does the subjective feeling have a non-ignorable impact on intelligence? If so, can the feeling be realized in artificial intelligence? To discuss the problems, we should clearly figure out what the feeling is by giving the definition. Before that, I'll first give some mainstream perspectives on the topic of the mind, especially the topic of the feeling. The reductive physicalism advocates that the mind is equivalent to the activity of a specific brain or a neural system. For example, pain is the activation of C fibers. Non-reductive physicalism believes that the mental state is determined by the physiological state in some way, and the former supervenes on the latter. If the physiological states of two organisms are exactly the same, then their conscious experience will also be the same. When the organism feels pain, it is inevitable that the neural C fibers of the organism will be activated. Under the context of AGI, a similar view holds that the phenomenal aspect of consciousness is a first-person perspective of a process, while the functional aspect is a third-person perspective of the same process. The two are different aspects of the same object, and the two cannot be separated. The current theories about the mind are mostly about calculations or functions, and they aim to solve the so-called simple problems in philosophy of mind. For example, neurobiological theory of consciousness proposed by Crick and Koch, the global workspace theory of consciousness proposed by Bernard Bars, and non-axiomatic reasoning system, that is NARS, proposed by Pei Wang. NARS uses the term self to refer to the system itself in order to achieve self-awareness and self-control. Although one claims that the phenomenal and functional aspects of consciousness are different perspectives of the same object, what NARS currently achieves is only the functional aspect of consciousness. What we concern is always how to create AGI. If the feeling is necessary for AGI or human-level AI, then the ceiling would become obvious. Only by understanding the essence of the feeling can we know how to create it. In our paper, we point out in the end the difficulties that may be faced with in the study of intelligence under some existing arguments of philosophy of mind. This is related to a very critical issue in philosophy of mind. That is the explanatory gap or the hard problem, both of which point the finger at the subjective aspect of the mind, that is the subjective feeling. More concretely, if mind-body supervenience is right, why is it pain instead of itch when some neurophysical state arises? To explain the relationship between neurophysical state and the feeling of pain is the so-called explanatory gap. At the same time, we're of course easy to answer the simple questions like how can a physical system learn or remember, but difficult to answer the hard problems similar to how does a physical system experience pain. Since representations are theoretically objective and observable, we can study the interaction of mechanism of representations through neuroscience, cognitive science, and even intelligence science, while the feeling is subjective, difficult to observe, and probably impossible to calculate or simulate. As Jaguar and King said, suppose that you are now given an assignment to design a pen box, a device that will enable the robot to experience the sensation of pen. It seems clear that even the best and brightest engineers would not know where to begin. What would you need to do to make it a pen box rather than an itch box, and how would you know you have succeeded? The functional aspect of pen can be designed and engineered into a system, but the qualitative aspect of pen, or pen as a quality, seems like a wholly different game. As another question, is the subjective feeling necessary for us? Kim pointed out that neuroscience and cognitive science acquiesce in epiphenomenalism, which implicitly agrees that the feeling does not cause any effects. Therefore, the feeling cannot be studied by scientific methods. Can we agree that the feeling is an epiphenomenon that will not affect future decisions and behaviors? The answer is no. It is possible that experience plays a causal role. As AGI researchers, we have to consider what this problem means for AGI research. If the feeling is epiphenomenal, we certainly do not need to consider the feeling and only consider the interaction mechanisms of representations. However, there is another possibility that experience plays a secret and critical role in our intelligence. Then the causal effect it produces will be displayed on instruments, and we can model it in a certain way by proposing a certain computational model to simulate the real feeling. Then there comes the question, can the subjective feeling be simulated through computational models? If it cannot be simulated accurately, will there be any serious consequences? These questions are difficult to answer, but through further discussion, we may have a deeper understanding as well as inspirations on these questions. We start by describing our positions. First, the feeling is something we truly experience. Even if the feeling is represented by words like happy, neurophysical states like neuronal membrane voltage, hormone like dopamine, etc., they are not the feeling per se, but the representations of the feeling. Second, the feeling could be expressed to form the representations, otherwise it is a non-existence for observer. Third, the feeling should not be defined as a specific or fixed function, because doing so confounds the feeling per se and the representations of the feeling. Fourth, the feeling should be somehow measured for AGI researching with a definition that captures the sense of the feeling to some extent. Consider such a room. From the outside, it is visually transparent, physically inaccessible, and unable to be observed by any scientific instrument unless there is matter emitted from the room. And the room is smaller than the smallest particle that physicists know as if it is transparent. From the inside, information from the outside world can reach the inside unimpededly. It is large enough for a person to live in. We might as well call it a semi-transparent room. The person who lives in the room is N. We can generally agree that N has the same subjective feeling as ours. The properties of the room are consistent with those of the feeling. Especially observed from the outside, the feeling per se is private without external representations, and it is unknown where the feeling comes from. Although under the gut view, we know that the feeling comes from N. N senses winds and the sun, as well as storms, and correspondingly she feels happy as well as pain. A breeze makes her happy and an electric shock makes her feel pain. However, so far, this room will not have any causal effect on the outside, and N cannot express her feelings to the outside world in any way. This room is like a mind, or in other words, a mind lives in it, and it has the subjective feeling. Although it does not present any physical state, or in other words, it only has a non-state when observed from the outside, and its internal state can be ever-changing. You might say that observed inside the room, N's feelings correspond to different neurophysical states. However, this is contrary to the experimental setting. observers can only observe it outside the room but cannot enter the room, just as we humans can only measure the membrane voltage of a neuron, but we cannot know the feeling of a neuron if there's a room inside the neuron. Even if a human enters the brain, it does not enter the room because representations of neural activations like spikes are something observed outside the room. The setting of the experiment is reasonable because the feeling is private thing. Later, we will let Anne to express her feelings to form representations. You might say that the state of the transparent room has actually changed because the external state has changed, and in fact, the physical state is represented by the external state. Then we can consider such a situation. The external state remains unchanged. It has always been so windy and sunny. Anne feels happy at first, but as time passes by, she becomes bored with this unchanged outside state, and her happiness fades away. An objectively observed state outside can indeed correspond to different feelings inside. You might say that if this is the case, then the feeling becomes something similar to an epiphenomenon, which is at a leaf node in a causal graph and does not produce any additional effects. Indeed, if the feeling cannot be represented in any way and cannot affect the physical state outside, then what is the difference between its existence and non-existence for an observer outside? If the feeling is an epiphenomenon, it is easier to handle. We can just ignore it because it will not have any impact on the behavior of the system. It will not have any impact on agents' interactions with the environment and will not have any impact on agents achieving goals. Is this really the case? According to our experience, it is obviously not. When we feel pain, we will escape, scream, cry bitterly, and express these feelings in various ways. Therefore, a reasonable approach is to give Anne a channel to express her feelings. Now the experimental setting is changed. There is an extra button in the semi-transparent room. After Anne presses the button in the room, photons are emitted with a wavelength of about 700 nanometers from the room to the world outside. For humans, this is a red light. Whenever the room emits a red light, if the environment is in a state of electric shock, it will become a state of non-electric shock. That is, if Anne feels pain at this time when she presses the button, this painful state will subside. After many explorations, she discovered this pattern, and from then on, whenever Anne feels pain, she would press the button. At this time, outside observers will see a red light, which, under the gut view, is a representation corresponding to Anne's pain. Does this mean that any mapping or function corresponds to a feeling? Just like an existing solution to the explanatory gap, pain is defined as the process from stimulus to response, which is essentially a mapping. When we feel happy, we love and secrete dopamine, so we define the process from stimuli that makes us happy to responses of the body caused by happiness as the feeling of happiness. We would also think a mechanical device within which a specific input leads to a specific output as having the feeling. This is contrary to our intuition, and we cannot agree with this view. Obviously, the feeling cannot be defined as a simple functional process. In order to understand what the feeling is, let us see how a semi-transparent room with the subjective feeling would do. Since the discussion will introduce another room as an observer of the current room, in order to make it easier to imagine, we might as well give the room a body like a stone, so that it is seen from the outside world as an independent object instead of none. But when no photons are emitted outward, the body is not different from an object that looks like a stone and does not seem to have the feeling. After introducing the body, the previous discussions are still valid. In another room, lives Bob, whose room is similar to Anne's. The only difference is that when the button in the room is pressed, the room emits photons with a wavelength of about 517 nanometers to the outside world. For humans, this is a green light. Facing the same environment, Anne and Bob have the feelings caused by the same representations of stimuli. For example, electric shock. When Anne is stimulated by an electric shock, Bob finds that Anne would always emit a red light. From this, Bob concludes that Anne would emit a red light to express pain as he feels. For the observer, Bob, pain is defined as a function of from pain stimulus to red light. However, it is not the case for Anne. For the observer Anne, pain is defined as a function of from pain stimulus to green light. Have they figured out what a pain is? Indeed, the feeling of pain is explained in a certain way. However, the gap between the feeling and the representations of the feeling has not been really bridged. We do not really understand why the feeling of pain corresponds to the physical state P instead of another one such as P prime, or why the physical state P corresponds to pain instead of another one such as H. Just as the observers Anne and Bob do not really understand why pain corresponds to this color of light instead of that color of light, or why pain corresponds to light instead of something else. This is obviously not the final answer to define the feeling as a certain specific process, because it confounds the representations of the feeling with the feeling per se. Red or green light is a representation of the feeling, and what Anne and Bob experience internally and privately is the feeling per se. If the feeling is not defined as a certain function of process, how to define it? Let's reconsider the semi-transparent room. There is an adaptive procedure. When an external stimulus makes Anne feel pain, Anne does not know what to do. The only thing she can try is to press the button. After several attempts, she discovers that when she feels pain, pressing the button always makes her feel better. So she learns to express the feeling of pain. When Anne feels pain, from the outside could always see the red light. To define the feeling within one sentence, the feeling should actually be a certain tendency with which the agent expresses the inner state of the feeling to form external representations and change the inner state by changing indirectly the representations of the input stimuli. For example, the feeling of happiness can be defined as things that the agent tends to increase or get close to, and the feeling of pain can be defined as things that the agent tends to decrease or stay away from. Formally, first, R equals T of S, where S is the representation of a certain stimulus, R is the representation of response, and T is the thinking function. Second, S prime equals E of R, where S prime is the new representation of a stimulus, and E is the environment function. Third, the adaptive procedure is trying to find a T to maximize D of S and S prime, where T measures the relationship between the representations S and S prime. For example, in the case of pain, D measures the difference of S and S prime. We cannot limit the environment or circumstances for observing the behaviors of a certain agent. Here is the reason. For any mechanical process, if the above definition is not met, for example, no matter how Anne pressed the button, the room would always produce mechanically specific responses without any adaptation. Then the feeling corresponds to the mechanical process does not exist externally. For such a completely mechanical room, even if Anne's room emits a red light under a certain stimulus, which decreases Anne's pain, we cannot say there is a feeling observed from the outside. Consider such a situation. After a period of time, the environment E changed. the original red light would not decrease N's pen ever. Originally, as long as N had pressed the button, her pen would have been decreased, but now the button was switched at a certain frequency to emit a flashing red light so that N's pen would be decreased. Observed from the outside, it seems that N's room did not make a change for the environment, or N did not adjust herself to stay away from the pen. Then we could not think that there is the feeling in N's room, because it were not essentially different from a simple mechanical process without a feeling, or the feeling did not cause any effect. As a specific function may work in many circumstances without any adaptation, but if a new circumstance occurs while the agent cannot adapt to it to decrease the pen, that is, the above definition is not met. We cannot say the agent had the feeling. We can only judge whether an object may have the feeling through external performance, but cannot really give a doubtless conclusion. Through observing behaviors, a bridge has been built between the subjective and the objective. The subjective feeling affects objective representations in some way, so that the subjective feeling becomes measurable and falsifiable to some extent. For an agent that meets the above definition, we can say that the statement that the agent has the feeling has positive evidence. For an agent that does not meet the above definition, we cannot say that it does not have the feeling, but we can say that there is no evidence showing that it has the feeling. From the above definition, the feeling must form external representations before we have positive evidence to accept its existence. At the same time, this implies a point of view that the feeling can be purely internal and unrepresented. So there are two cases that need to be specifically discussed. For the first case, just like the counterfactual philosophical zombie, if the agent's external performance is the same as one without the subjective feeling, then the feeling could be an epiphenomenon. The feeling does not affect the objective process, and we need to only study the objective laws of intelligence. For AGI researchers, the philosophical zombie is acceptable. It doesn't matter if there is no real feeling, because human-level intelligence can also be reached without a feeling. For the second case, an agent may inhibit expressing the feelings so as not to form an externally observable representation. If the private feeling is not expressed, that is, N and Bob does not press a button, then we cannot claim as before that at this time it will not cause any external effect, so it will not affect the objective process. And for AGI, it does not matter whether it exists or not. In this case, the internal causal effect cannot be ignored. That is, although there is no representation of the feeling at present, the internal feeling is indeed experienced. So at some point in the agent's future, the current inhibited expression of the feeling leads to a distinct representation. In this case, T would become more complicated, but the form in the definition of the feeling remains unchanged. However, reconsidering the above two cases, we are still not sure whether a philosophical zombie without the feeling will behave differently from an agent with the feeling. Nor can we know exactly what D and T are. Of course, we can strive to find a computational model. We call the computational model that meets the definition of the feeling above as the simulated feeling, and call the natural being of the feeling as the innate feeling. The question then becomes, if the simulated feeling is somewhat different from the innate feeling, will it lead to a serious impact on an AGI system? How accurately can a computational model fit the innate feeling? All this needs to be answered through experiments. We should find an agent with the innate feeling and compare the artificial agent with it and see if they behave the same in some sense. Unfortunately, in the above definition, it is argued that the test environment must be open, which is also crucial for AGI. Will an agent with the simulated feeling behaves the same as one with the innate feeling at any circumstances? This is difficult to confirm because the condition of any circumstances is difficult to achieve, and an experiment can only test a model with under limited circumstances. A more serious issue is how to compare the two kinds of agents fairly to judge if they behave the same. In addition, what if the innate feeling cannot be fully modeled by a computational process? If it is necessary to have such the innate feeling in order to achieve human level or higher level AI or realize the mind with artifacts, then where does the feeling ultimately come from, and how to achieve an interface that allows the innate feeling to be expressed? Perhaps this is the hard problem for intelligence. In summary, if the innate feeling cannot be realized, what kind of impact will it have on the artificial intelligence system? And if there must be the innate feeling, how to realize it? This problem cannot be answered under the current research, and it is left to the future. If the problem cannot be solved by the existing classical computing methods, then the feeling problem may be the ceiling of the current AI research. If the subjective feeling plays an indispensable role, that is, agents with the feeling and agents without the feeling counterfactually, such as philosophical zombies, are distinct significantly in terms of performances, and if without the feeling human-level AI cannot be reached, then we must study the feeling. However, the feeling is subjective and private, while scientists study objective phenomena. If we cannot measure the feeling, we cannot study it scientifically. Therefore, our paper discusses the impact of the subjective feeling on AGI research. If the feeling is an epiphenomenon, then we can just ignore it. Otherwise, it plays an indispensable role, so we try to give a possible solution for a machine to have the feeling. We define the feeling as a tendency to change the input representation and think that the performance of an agent conforms to the definition, provides positive evidence for that the agent has the feeling. If the definition captures the sense of the feeling, then the feeling becomes measurable. However, whether it is possible and how to find a computational model for the simulated feeling to fit the innate feeling remain unknown. I should clarify that the concept computation has a meaning given by Alan Turing. A computational process maps a series of input into a series of output step by step. However, the computation here means interactions of representations. The difference between the simulated feeling and the innate feeling is similar to the difference between appearance and reality. In addition, in consideration of completeness of this presentation, we want to emphasize another perspective which I did not focus on, that is, the potential relationship between consciousness and quantum mind. Quantum biology studies have shown that at room temperature, quantum coherence can exist in organisms for enough time. Fisher proposed an exciting quantum neural theory based on the nuclear spin of phosphorus, and Hu believes that quantum processes in neural activity can be coupled with space-time dynamics. Xiaogang Wen's theoretical research has proved that the essence of matter and space-time is quantum information, and Wen already tried to unify the ontology of physics and social science from the perspective of quantum mind. In the future, my advisor, Professor Ren, will write a second article discussing the gap between intelligence and mind from a quantum perspective. Thank you for listening.